So Grainia, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So Grainia, I think that a lot of people usually ask us, what does a CRO actually do? And you, as the Commissioner for Resilience, what do you do and how do you describe it? And then why did you decide to become Belfast's first Commissioner for Resilience?
Lots of people ask what the purpose of a Chief Resilience Officer is. And I think it's one of those roles where clarity arrives through action. So they are very much problem-solving roles, and they are very much focused on, first of all, identifying what the strategic risks are at a city level, at an urban level. And I was surprised, Lina, when I came into post, how little we'd done that thinking collectively as a city. So what I found were fantastic organisations all across the city that had a really strong sense of corporate risk. So each of their organisations managing risk really well, but very little thinking at a citywide level about how those risks interrelate and the relationship between them to each other. So I think in a way that's why these roles are probably quite different depending on the city and depending on the level of maturity and approach to risk at a city level. So my role within Belfast and at a Belfast level is very much about identifying risks, identifying how those risks have been managed up to now, but then really pulling together partnerships and institutionalizing effective risk management. And when I talk about risk, I mean in the broadest sense. So different cities, depending on the problems they're trying to solve, the role of the Resilience Commissioner, I think, ebbs and flows and changes. So I think other cities probably have more of an economic focus. Some cities focus on social risks or social concerns that need to be managed. And in my case, what I found over time is that even though the role was originally intended to be a very economically focused role, and my background is housing and the economics of housing, but what I found when I came into post was actually the biggest, or arguably the biggest long-term economic risk for Belfast is climate change. So what I've been doing is working to integrate our economic strategy and our climate strategy. So I've had to learn very fast into new areas that, frankly, I knew very little about. And that's why these roles work best when they are genuine partnering roles.
And you talked about working with other stakeholders outside of the city, but how, I mean, for the last 2 years, working within the council, what has been your experience of working with others and how potentially this has evolved during the years?
It's never an easy approach to take. I think it's quite a brave approach on the part of any organisation to put into place or to establish a role that is genuinely cross-cutting and is cross-cutting at a very senior level. So all organisations go through periods where we are silo-oriented. So people have their own positions and they closely guard all the energy and all the resources together. And so what Belfast City Council did, and it's to the credit of the elected members and the chief executive here, was to identify that actually as an organisation we would really benefit from a role that was cross-cutting, so that cut across a whole range of different directorates within the organisation, and then over time expanded that beyond the organisation to the wider city. I think that's worked well, actually, and maybe I'm the wrong person to ask because, essentially my role has been about driving that and bringing people together. But it hasn't always been easy, and I think part of what we've learned as an organisation is that there are huge benefits from closer working and from sharing of risk and reward across the organisation. And in a way, I think one of the happiest moments for me was when not only has this role continued, but actually most recently we've appointed a digital innovation commissioner now for the city. So that's somebody who sits within Belfast City Council, who works across the organisation, but also works across our partners. So actually the idea of having a commissioner, a cross-cutting role, seems to now have stuck. And so we're building beyond that. And actually we work now extremely closely, and what we're starting to see is digital innovation and climate activity really merging as well. So there's lots of lessons, I think, for us to have learned about greater cross-cutting work, but I think now how we expand that beyond our organisation and the wider city.
And what do you think that are some main achievements from your role within, again, these last couple of years?
So there's a number. First of all, and I've said this publicly, I was taken aback by how little at a citywide level we had planned for the effects of climate change at all at a city level. So one of the achievements for me was in developing our resilience strategy, gathering the data and really helping not just Belfast City Council, but the entire number of city partners to understand the scale of the crisis, the nature of the crisis, how it's going to impact on us as a city, what's unique about us, both in terms of our topography, our geography as a city, our culture, our society. It's going to affect us in certain ways. We're a port city, we're a university city with a very young population. So one of the achievements for me has been, in a way, actually just pointing to this huge and strategic and long-term challenge for the city and helping all of us together collectively to understand that, to understand how it might affect us and to start putting a meaningful, genuinely well-resourced climate plan together. I think secondly, institutionalising all of that. So that's really important. You can have great strategies, but nobody takes them forward. So I'm quite proud of the fact that we now have a board at city level where we bring all the partners round the table. It's a formal board. It reports up to this, the institutions across the city, and it has decision makers round the table. So people from Northern Ireland Water, so from the water organisation, the transport organisation, the housing authority, and the city council as the planning authority, and we all work together collectively now to solve problems. So setting the strategy is one thing, but institutionalising it is really important. And I suppose thirdly, we've also established a climate commission. So we work now in partnership with Queen's University to bring all of the academics and the knowledge and the analysis that we need together to help us to plan really long term. And I think that's been a real eye-opener for us, because what we now have is two structures: a climate commission, which is the thinker, the analytical structure in the city, and our resilience board, which is the doing and the delivery board. And it's really lovely having both of them together, and from time to time they come together as well, and you start to see that lovely clash that happens when different professions come together. And I love that, because you can really solve problems when you have people with a different professional background. We all look at things differently and we solve problems differently. So it's a very exciting time, really exciting time, having put that in place now to start to see it really taking effect.
And what do you think will this role evolve within the years? And I'm saying that because we've seen in a lot of our member cities that, for example, the job description of a CRO at the beginning is different than after they pass through and there's a deeper understanding within the city about what resilience is. So we've seen this kind of evolution. Do you think that this will also change within Belfast? How do you see the future of resilience and your role within the council?
It will naturally change. The role will change and evolve depending on what the city needs from it. And it's one of those roles, I think, that already naturally I have spent more of my time on climate related and energy related and infrastructure issues than I have necessarily on economic issues, even though the two are interrelated. And as I say, we're developing a climate strategy that's integrated with our economic strategy. The two are, of course, interlinked. But I think naturally we've narrowed down our focus in terms of so that it reflects the resilience challenges for Belfast. And I've spoken to my colleagues in other cities, and we've all done similar things. So Chief Resilience Officer arrives, does the analysis, points to the big strategic risks, and then depending on what the main or primary risks are, tends to spend the majority of their time on those. And that's how we do risk management generally, isn't it? We can't focus on every risk. You focus on where you can have the biggest effect. And where the interventions need to lie. So I think naturally my role will change, or the role will change, and I'm pleased to see that. It shouldn't be the same all of the time. Life moves on and cities change.
There are a lot of cities that might say that they don't have the resources to have or appoint a new person, but on the other hand they recognize the need for this kind of thinking and this kind of cross-cutting approach. So are there any kind of lessons learned or suggestions or advice for cities on how to approach this?
Yes, it's interesting. You know, when you have roles like this, it provides the organisation with a resource to get the best out of other resources. So what I'm able to do is to bring together people and professionals and organisations and to get the best out of them by realising the linkages that they already have or should have, and they're not making the most of them, and they're not leveraging them to the right effect. So what I constantly see in this role are colleagues of mine in other organisations solving the same problems, but not even being aware that they're both doing it. And part of my role is to bring them together and help them share their resources, and in a lot of cases start to save resources because they can work in partnership. So what I would say to cities that are thinking, is this too expensive a resource, is have a think about the big, really sticky problems that you've been trying to deal with for years, and take a look at them from a different perspective, and try to bring some professionals together who've never looked at these issues and see will they find a different angle or a different approach to it. Two things have happened in Belfast in the last number of years, two major shocks to the city. The first, not long after I joined into this role, was a major fire in the city centre, which brought the city to a halt. We had to place a major cordon around a huge building in the city centre. It meant rerouting buses. It meant changing our retail and our footfall, the footprint of the city and how people moved around. That wasn't long after I joined, and what I found very, very early on in helping to coordinate some of the response to that was how rarely people asked me what the point of me was once a shock hits. So and then the second major shock, of course, is not just the pandemic itself, but the economic and the social impact arising from the pandemic. So, cities tend to see resilience as a nice to have in times when it doesn't look like we have major shocks or stresses to deal with. When they hit, quite understandably, everybody wants to know, why don't we have a resilience commissioner, or why don't we have a chief resilience officer? And that's not to say that my role is an emergency planning role. It's not. It's a strategic role, and I tend to focus on longer term risks. But having a resource that enables the city to consistently look ahead and to have our eye on the horizon and preparing for strategic risks, I think is a resource that's really, really, and has been proven to be effective. And I'm saying this in terms of other cities. We've learned a huge amount in Belfast from what other cities have done by taking a longer term view of risk. And I think we're now really starting to reap the rewards of that.
You said that your role is not emergency planning. So could you elaborate a bit more about what was your role during the pandemic, and especially the discussion around recovery and building back better and so on?
When the pandemic hit in Belfast, we were able to take advantage of the fact that as a city we have an extremely well-established emergency services coordinating group, the Emergency Preparedness Group, which exists here and has existed for a number of years and are frankly phenomenal in their work. And it brings together council colleagues, fire and rescue service, ambulance, police, and they've always worked really well together certainly for a very, very long time here. So that group swung into action, and they took forward the immediate response phase. And are still there and are still managing that, and will be managing that throughout the course of this pandemic as it ebbs and flows, and as we see changes to how the pandemic impacts on the city. What I was able to do, working with colleagues, not just in council, but also in the wider city, is to think about how do we put together a plan. And I was one of a number of people doing this together, so it wasn't just me, but how do we go beyond response to two further phases? So we identified the rebuild phase, which was about reopening our city, but doing it in a way that was led by a health and safety perspective, so very much led by the guidance from government, and then going beyond the rebuild phase into recovery phase. So we took a very long-term lens, and worked our way back. We looked at a number of scenarios. We undertook a risk assessment. We pulled together all of the data that was available to us across a range of strands and work streams. So we had a number of people taking on streams of work that were, as I say, led by data, developing scenarios for how to rebuild and recover the city. But what I'm pleased to see also is that we have, in putting our plan together, taken a look at how we do economic recovery, social and community recovery, but also in doing that recovery, ensuring that we don't forget that we have a longer term environmental or climate related challenge to come. So all our interventions post-COVID in terms of building recovery have climate resilience, climate adaptation at their heart. As I keep saying, any stimulus that we have that we're going to invest in our city post-COVID, we will only get once. And that stimulus has to be designed for delivery in a way that makes us more prepared for the effects of climate change. And that's not always an easy case to make because people are looking to the immediate and necessarily don't always want to hear about the next crisis that's coming. But we only get that stimulus once, we get to spend it once, and how we spend it will dictate the next decade and the decade beyond. And so that's the drum I've been banging, and I'm pleased to say I'm not the only one doing it, and it is fully accepted at council level and at citywide level now that what we spend, we have to spend extremely wisely and constantly thinking, how will this make us more prepared for the effects of climate change, and how will it build our adaptive capacity in terms of climate and climate action?
So thank you very much. A last question from my side. And then I would like to ask Charles whether he has questions for you. We are in the Creative Bureaucracy Festival. So a lot of people usually connect resilience with, disasters, risk. Do you feel that this is a creative position? Do you feel that you bring, imagination or a new kind of air within the municipality?
I think so. So in a way, I can't imagine doing this role without being creative. And so here's a number of reasons why. First of all, it's a brand new role for the city. So when you get a brand new role, I certainly am of the view that a brand new role, you rarely get this in your career. So I felt very lucky to have the opportunity to shape it. So that requires creativity. It required me to sit back and say, what do we want this role to look like? How do we want people to describe it maybe 5 years from now? So it's really unique actually in your career that you get a chance to design, and it's obviously co-design. It's with partners and people and council and elected members. So that's first of all how it's been creative. I think it's also been creative because it's the kind of role where you don't know what's coming next. So it constantly requires you to be thinking about the future, and that requires a very creative viewpoint, I think. So I'm a member of the RSA in the UK, and the RSA very much takes the view that we need kind of systems entrepreneurs. So we need people who can go into organisations and think in an entrepreneurial way. And I'm quite taken with that. And I'm not suggesting that I'm one of those people, but I've certainly learned a lot from people who do think beyond the system and actually think how do we bend the system towards something else rather than, going into a system to work within it. And entirely in that way. I think you have to find ways and routes to kind of bending the system towards problem solving rather than necessarily the other way around. So it doesn't feel like that every day. It doesn't feel like every day you can be wonderfully creative and just do what you want and just constantly design the future. Of course not. But I think in roles like this, it is about testing the system and trying new things. And I suppose the final point I would make is, I think certainly in roles like this, you have to be prepared to fail and you have to be prepared to try things and quite publicly say that didn't work. And we've had plenty of those too. And so I think probably it requires somebody who has had a career in where they've arrived at a point where they can afford to do this role, I guess, having run other organisations and having had the opportunity to make mistakes publicly. This role allows you to do that, but you do have to be prepared for a little bit of public criticism, and rightly so. This is public money, so it's not about wasting money, but it is about taking the right kind of risks in the right way so we can move forward.
Thank you, Grania. So I think we are almost at the end of our time. Charles, I look at you for any additional questions or reflections.
Yeah. What strikes me is that Grania thinks on her feet, that she takes a glass half full approach to life. All of these seem to me the sort of preconditions to sort of look at afresh at things. So the three little questions I have is, it strikes me that you're a bit like the strategic foresight department. I mean, sometimes resilience sounds worthy, but if I say the imagining the future department, I think you're part of that department. The second question I just wanted to ask is, you've got these partnerships, but do you think it's embedded further down? I mean, has the phrase, the concept, been sort of understood at sort of level 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever that means, but in terms of a wider public? I wonder what you think.
I love the idea of having a strategic foresight department. So I'm going to pop that in the ideas box. But I think you're right. I mean, if we don't formally have one, then yes, it is our role to be consistently looking at the future. So there's lots and lots of documents and research reports that come in to my team and to the resilience board, and sometimes people may say, oh, it must be nice to be able to just sit there and imagine the future. But actually, if we imagine the future better, perhaps globally, we may have been better prepared for a pandemic, and certainly we may have been better prepared for the scenarios beyond the pandemic. Because what has struck me about COVID-19 is, even if we could have predicted the pandemic, I don't think we were at all prepared for the effects beyond that. And it still feels like we are planning very, very short term globally. I genuinely mean this globally. We really have not got a sense of beyond 2020, 2021. So strategic foresight, I think, is something we need to value much more and not see it as a luxury. Onto your second point about how it changes the culture of an organization. It's very difficult to really know the answer to that question. And I think that's where we would have to kind of ask those people rather than me answer on their behalf. What I would say, though, is because when I came into the role, we had a city crisis pretty quickly afterwards, and that required everybody to be galvanized around a particular problem to solve. What I would say is, and I would certainly not suggest to anyone that you would want a crisis like that or certainly want to imagine it or manufacture it, but what you can do is identify problems and say, right, we now know it. There's a problem that's always been there, but we've never really looked at it as a problem in that way before. So now let's put a team of people together, and it shouldn't all be senior people. It's best when it's not. It's best when the problem solvers are the people doing the doing, so to speak, and the people who are delivering. So I learned a lot actually from working in the tech industry. I think they're much better than any other industry in spending time on the problem. And they don't do what I did for years, and I wish I'd learned this much earlier on in my career, was go straight to the solution. I spent far too much time in my 20s and 30s thinking, right, I think I understand the problem now. I'm going to go on to policy solutions. Actually spend ages on the problem. I learned that from tech colleagues. And just when you think you've had enough of the problem, spend some more time and look at it from every angle. And then actually the solutions become much clearer. So, define the solution really well and put some good people around it. And that's what I've learned hugely from this job.
Well, thanks. That's all from my side. And thank you, Grainia and Lina. I'm sure the rules and regulations in Belfast are changing because of your impact, and I certainly hope they are. So this, as we know, is one of the key issues of the century, resilience. And I'm so glad you're here right at the beginning of what we're doing in the big breakfast. Thank you very much, both of you.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.